The Sterling name had never tolerated mediocrity, and tonight they made no exception. Amid a lavish engagement party teeming with the city's elite, the bride-to-be was relentlessly scorned by the groom's family, everyone certain she was nothing more than a ghost at their opulent feast. No one rose to her defense, least of all the man who had placed a ring on her finger, but as the gilded crowd reveled in her quiet humiliation, they remained blissfully unaware of the unseen power she held, a power that could shatter their glittering world with a single word. The air at the Sterling estate was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and expensive perfume, a cloying combination that clung to the back of Alara Vance's throat. She stood at the edge of the sprawling, manicured gardens, her hands clasped loosely before the simple beige silk of her dress. A string quartet, positioned near a marble gazebo, was playing a soft, melancholic piece by Vivaldi, but their beautiful music was nearly drowned out by the cacophony of forced laughter and the sharp clinking of crystal champagne flutes. This was supposed to be her engagement party, a celebration of her impending union with Preston Sterling. Yet, as she watched the sea of glittering guests, it felt less like a celebration and more like a final, silent judgment. Preston had promised her it would be small, just family and our closest friends, he'd murmured, his breath warm against her ear just a week ago. Intimate. His definition of intimate, it turned out, was 300 of the city's most influential figures, all dripping in designer labels and heirloom jewels. Their laughter was as sharp as their tailored suits, their eyes even sharper, constantly scanning, appraising, and dismissing. Against this backdrop of ostentatious wealth, Alara felt like a phantom. Her dress, chosen for its quiet elegance and comfort, hung on her frame with an understated grace that, in this crowd, was misinterpreted as poverty. It had no visible brand, no dazzling embellishments. She wore no jewelry, save for the modest but elegant engagement ring Preston had given her. A single, flawless diamond on a platinum band, a ring that now felt impossibly heavy on her finger. Her dark, almost black hair was pulled back into a low, intricate bun, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She wore no makeup, trusting the natural blush of her olive skin. Hers was a subtle beauty, a quiet strength that did not scream for attention. It was the kind of beauty one noticed in the shifting light of a quiet room, not under the glare of ornamental floodlights. To this crowd, it was invisible. Or worse, it was a weakness, a target. For the better part of an hour, she had stood alone by a tiered marble fountain, the gentle sound of cascading water her only companion. She watched Preston, her fiancé, holding court near a towering ice sculpture of two swans. He was laughing, a broad, performative smile stretched across his handsome face as he clapped a portly man in a tuxedo on the back. He was in his element, a prince in his kingdom, and he hadn't so much as glanced her way since they had arrived. A cold knot began to form in the pit of her stomach, a feeling she had become increasingly familiar with in the months since their engagement. It was the chilling realization that the Preston she knew in private, the warm, attentive man who spoke of building a life based on partnership, vanished the moment he stepped into his family's world, replaced by this polished, distant stranger. A woman in a gown made of what seemed to be liquid gold, her décolletage sparkling with an aggressive number of diamonds, bumped into Alara without slowing her stride. The impact sent a cascade of champagne from the woman's glass onto the sleeve of Alara's silk dress. The cold liquid seeped through the fabric, shocking against her warm skin. The woman didn't apologize. She merely glanced over her shoulder, her perfectly painted lips twisting into a dismissive smirk. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You must be the staff. Do be more careful." She turned and blended back into the crowd, leaving a trail of laughter from her companions in her wake. Alara looked down at the damp, spreading stain on her sleeve. She took a pristine white napkin from a nearby tray and gently blotted the fabric, her expression a mask of serene neutrality. But inside, the cold knot tightened. Her fingers, usually so steady, paused for a fraction of a second on the damaged silk. It was a simple, thoughtless act of cruelty, yet it felt like the opening salvo in a war she hadn't known she was fighting. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, some curious, some contemptuous. She was an anomaly, an unsolved puzzle, and they were all trying to fit her into a box she had no intention of entering. As the evening wore on, the subtle slights grew bolder, like predators testing the defenses of their prey. A young man with slicked-back hair and a velvet jacket approached her near the sprawling dessert table, which was laden with everything from gold-dusted macarons to miniature crème brûlées. He was a distant cousin of Preston's, the kind of man who measured his own worth by the brand of his watch and the prestige of his Ivy League degree, a fact he managed to weave into every conversation. He eyed her dress from head to toe, a slow, insolent appraisal that made her skin crawl. A smirk played on his lips. "This isn't a thrift store event, you know," he said, his voice loud enough for the small group gathered around him to hear. "Did you borrow that from your maid?" The group snickered in unison. The sound was a low, ugly thing, a chorus of shared superiority. Champagne flutes clinked as they leaned in, their faces alight with gleeful anticipation, waiting to see the charity case crumble. Alara had been holding a small porcelain plate with a single perfect strawberry on it. She set the plate down on the crisp linen of the table, her movements slow, precise, and utterly devoid of agitation. She had learned long ago in hostile boardrooms that panic was a currency she would never trade in. She met the cousin's gaze, her own dark eyes, steady and unblinking. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture of mild curiosity that was deeply unsettling to those who expected tears or anger. "Borrowed anything yourself lately?" she asked. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the snickering like a shard of glass. "Your manners, perhaps?" The cousin's smirk faltered. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and his hand brushed nervously against the lapel of his velvet jacket as if checking for a wallet that was suddenly missing. The confidence evaporated from his face, replaced by a flush of red that crept up his neck. The group's laughter died down into an awkward silence. He muttered something about needing another drink and slipped away, his retreat far less graceful than his approach. Alara turned back to the dessert table. She picked up the single strawberry again, her fingers lingering on its delicate stem for a moment before she placed it back down on the plate, untouched. Her appetite had vanished completely. She felt a presence beside her and turned, her heart giving a small, hopeful leap, thinking it might be Preston, finally come to rescue her. But it was not. It was Genevieve Sterling, Preston's mother, the matriarch of the clan. She was a woman of 57, though her face, taut and unnaturally smooth from years of Botox and surgical enhancements, betrayed no age, only a chilling lack of expression. Her heels clicked like ice cracking on the stone patio as she strutted across the lawn, a queen surveying her domain. She stopped directly in front of Alara, her cold blue eyes raking over the simple beige dress with undisguised disdain. "This isn't custom-made, is it?" Genevieve said, her voice pitched just loud enough to capture the attention of at least a dozen nearby guests, who immediately paused their conversations to watch the unfolding drama. The Sterling family has never accepted cheap fabric. It speaks of a certain lack of breeding. A ripple of cruel laughter spread through the crowd. It was no longer subtle. This was a public execution of her character. Alara met her future mother-in-law's gaze, her own expression remaining placid, a calm sea over a raging storm. She didn't speak. To engage would be to validate the insult, to sink to their level. Her silence, she knew, was a more powerful weapon than any retort. It was a shield they did not know how to penetrate. A woman dripping in pearls, an aunt by marriage, leaned in conspiratorially to her friend, though her voice carried clearly to the group by the bar. "She's obviously here for the money. A classic gold digger. Preston must be blind." The words landed like a physical slap, but Alara's posture remained ramrod straight. She simply adjusted the thin leather strap of her handbag on her shoulder, the movement slow and deliberate, a small act of defiance in the face of their venom. Then Arthur Sterling, Preston's father, joined his wife. He was a formidable man, dressed in a pristine gray suit that seemed molded to his frame. His eyes were the color of cold steel, and they held the same unforgiving quality. He looked at Alara not as a future daughter-in-law, but as a line item on a balance sheet, a potential liability. "What assets does your family have to prove you're worthy of the Sterling name?" he asked, his tone flat, devoid of any warmth. It wasn't a question. It was a demand, a challenge issued before a jury of their peers. The crowd murmured their approval, their voices blending into a low hum of judgment. "A girl with no pedigree wants to become a sterling," someone whispered, the sound sharp with mockery, the audacity. Through it all, Alara's eyes searched for Preston. He stood just a few feet away, trapped in a conversation with a senator. He had heard. She knew he had. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his forced smile tightened at the corners. He met her gaze for a fleeting second, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and helplessness, before he looked away, turning his back to her completely. And in that moment, something inside Alara shifted. The disappointment, the hurt, it began to cool, to harden, crystallizing into something else entirely. It was a cold, clear resolve. Her hand, which had been clutching the strap of her bag, tightened for just a moment, her knuckles showing white. Then, she consciously relaxed her grip, letting it go. She was not their victim. She was an observer, collecting data. Every insult, every sneer, every moment of Preston's cowardice, it was all just information. Information she would use to make a decision. The night dragged on, a seemingly endless parade of veiled insults and overt contempt. A socialite known for her charity galas and her even more famous capacity for cruelty sidled up to Alara, her smile as sharp as a blade. "You must feel so out of place," she said, her voice syrupy with fake concern. "I mean, look around. This isn't your world, is it?" Alara didn't flinch. Her fingers brushed against the cool rim of her water glass, the faintest tremble in her hand before she stilled it with sheer force of will. She looked at the woman, her gaze direct and unwavering. "My world," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle, "is much bigger than you think." The socialite's smile froze. Her eyes narrowed, searching Alara's face for a sign of weakness, of bluffing. But before she could formulate a response, Alara turned away, her steps measured and confident, leaving the woman clutching her drink a little too tightly, a flicker of uncertainty on her face. The comments kept coming, each one sharper, like knives thrown from the shadows. "Look at her shoes," a young woman in a garish red dress said, loud enough for half the garden to hear. "They're practically falling apart." They weren't. They were simple black flats, impeccably clean but clearly worn and comfortable. But the crowd laughed anyway, eager for any excuse to mock the outsider. A man with a Rolex that could have paid off a mortgage chimed in, his voice thick with entitlement. She must have wandered in from the wrong side of town. More laughter, vicious, unthinking laughter. Alara stood still, her posture erect, her eyes scanning the crowd. She wasn't just enduring, she was memorizing. Every smug face, every cruel smile, every whisper. She was the CEO of Vance Dynamics, a multi-billion-dollar global corporation, a titan of industry who operated from the shadows, her identity the most closely guarded secret in the financial world. She had dismantled companies, outmaneuvered the most ruthless corporate raiders on Wall Street, and built an empire from the ground up. She was used to battles. But this was different. This was personal, and it was a battle she had naively hoped she wouldn't have to fight. She had fallen in love with Preston Sterling, or at least, with the man she thought he was. She had wanted, for once, to be just Alara. Not the CEO, not the strategist, just a woman in love. She had kept her identity a secret from him and his family, wanting them to accept her for who she was, not for the power she wielded. It was a test, a foolishly romantic one, she now realized, and they were failing in spectacular fashion. Near the edge of the garden, by a hedge of pristine white roses, a hedge fund manager cornered her as she reached for a glass of water. He was the kind of man who thrived on making others feel small to inflate his own ego. "You're not even trying to fit in," he said, his voice loud enough to draw a small crowd. "What's the point of showing up if you're just going to embarrass yourself? And by extension, embarrass Preston?" The guests around him nodded, their smirks growing. Alara set her glass down, her hands perfectly steady. She looked at him, her eyes unblinking, holding his gaze until he started to shift uncomfortably. "Embarrassment is a choice," she said, her voice low but cutting, each word precisely enunciated. "You're making it right now." The man's face reddened. He stammered, unable to find a retort, his bravado deflating like a punctured balloon. He turned away, muttering something about the heat, and the crowd's laughter faltered. Alara adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers brushing against the cool, metallic clasp. Inside that simple leather bag was a phone that controlled an empire. A phone that, with a few taps, could bring the entire Sterling dynasty to its knees. Their family company, Sterling Corp., was on the brink of financial ruin, a fact they had managed to keep hidden from the public. Their only salvation was a rumored $2 billion partnership with the elusive and mysterious Vance Dynamics, a deal that she, and only she, had the power to approve. They thought she was a nobody, a shadow. They thought she needed their name, their money, their world. A slow, cold smile touched Alara's lips, a smile so faint it was almost imperceptible. They had no idea. They were mocking their savior, and her patience was beginning to wear thin. The night was far from over, and Alara had a feeling that before it was, the Sterlings would learn exactly who they had invited into their home. The faint, cold smile lingered on Alara's lips long after the flustered hedge fund manager had retreated. It was not a smile of amusement, but of grim finality. The evening had ceased to be a social obligation she had to endure. It had transformed into a final, comprehensive assessment. In her world, one did not enter a multi-billion-dollar partnership without rigorous due diligence. She vetted financials, analyzed market stability, and, most importantly, she judged character. The Sterlings, in their arrogant ignorance, were submitting their character for review, and they were failing on every conceivable metric. The air around her, once merely hostile, now felt charged with a different energy. Her quiet, unyielding composure had unnerved them. They had expected tears, a panicked retreat, or a desperate attempt to fit in. Her refusal to play the part of the frightened mouse had disrupted their cruel game, and they did not like it. Genevieve Sterling, in particular, seemed personally offended by Alara's resilience. Her face, a mask of calculated perfection, was marred by a slight tightening around her eyes. She circled back, her wineglass held like a scepter, her movements predatory. She would not be upstaged by this nobody. "You know, dear," Genevieve began, her voice once again projecting for the benefit of a new audience that had gathered, "Preston deserves someone who can keep up with our world. Someone with substance." She let the word hang in the air, weighted with insinuation. "You're just not that girl." The words were meant to be a final, dismissive judgment. The guests nodded in smug agreement, their faces reflecting Genevieve's disdain. A man in a navy blazer, his voice slick with arrogance, added his own contribution. "She's probably never even been to a proper gala," he scoffed. The crowd laughed again, louder this time, a wave of ridicule washing over Alara. She felt a muscle in her jaw tighten, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of the fury that was slowly building beneath her calm exterior. She didn't respond, but she shifted her weight, a subtle repositioning of her body that felt like a warrior bracing for impact. Her hand, as if of its own accord, came to rest on the leather of her handbag, her fingers finding the cool, hard outline of her phone within. The temptation to end the charade right there, to unleash the storm and watch their shocked faces, was immense. But not yet. The lesson had to be delivered with maximum impact. Preston was still across the lawn, his back to her, laughing at a joke one of his groomsmen had told. He was a portrait of willful ignorance, a man so terrified of his family's disapproval that he would sacrifice his own integrity, his own fiancée, to maintain his place in their gilded cage. The last vestiges of Alara's affection for him withered and died in that moment, turning to ash. A woman in a sequin dress, her voice sharp and gleeful, called out across the patio, "Why is she even here? She looks like she's waiting for a bus." The crowd roared with laughter. It was the most openly cruel comment of the night, and it felt like a point of no return. Alara's hand paused on her phone. She slowly lifted her head and looked directly at the woman. Her eyes, which had been passive and observant, now held a piercing intensity. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was low and clear, cutting through the laughter like a surgeon's scalpel. The laughter stopped abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. The woman in the sequin dress opened her mouth, then closed it, a flicker of unease crossing her face. She turned away, suddenly finding her champagne flute intensely interesting. The moment was broken, but the air remained heavy with unspoken tension. Just then, as if the universe itself wanted to test the limits of human cruelty, a young server carrying a heavy tray of fresh champagne glasses navigated through the throng of guests. He was young, perhaps 19, his cheeks flushed with the stress of the high-profile event. As he passed near Alara, a guest stepped backward without looking, bumping into the server's arm. The young man stumbled, his balance lost. The tray tilted, and in a horrific, slow-motion cascade, 24 crystal glasses crashed to the stone patio, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed immediately by a sharp, immediate burst of laughter. The tension that had been building found a new, easier target. A woman in a gold dress, her voice thick with glee, called out, pointing a perfectly manicured finger. "Even the staff knows she doesn't belong here." The guests roared, their eyes glinting with malicious amusement as they looked from the humiliated server to Alara, lumping them together as twin symbols of incompetence. The server, his face now a deep crimson, stammered an apology, his hands shaking as he stared at the glittering wreckage at his feet. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Sterling. But before he could finish, Alara moved. While the others laughed and pointed, she knelt. The simple beige silk of her dress pooled on the stone ground, inches from the broken glass. She ignored the gasps of the onlookers. Her hands moved carefully, picking up the larger pieces of glass and placing them back on the now unsteady tray. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a folded linen napkin, and handed it to the boy. "It's okay," she said, her voice quiet but firm, loud enough only for him and the few guests nearest to them to hear. "Accidents happen." The server looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. He nodded, his hands shaking a little less as he took the napkin and began to help. The woman in the gold dress stopped laughing, her face tightening with annoyance as Alara stood, brushing her hands clean. Alara's gaze swept across the crowd, not with anger, but with a look of profound disappointment that was somehow more damning. It was a challenge. The laughter died down completely, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. A few guests looked away, suddenly finding their shoes, their drinks, the distant stars, anything more interesting than the scene in front of them. The Sterlings, however, were not to be shamed. To them, Alara's act of kindness was just another mark against her, an admission that she was more comfortable with the staff than with her supposed peers. They saw it as an opportunity to reassert their dominance, to put the upstart back in her place with a final, overwhelming show of power. Genevieve raised her glass high, her voice booming across the now quiet garden, demanding attention. "A toast," she declared. The remaining guests turned towards her obediently. Her eyes, cold and triumphant, flicked to Alara. "We are on the verge of closing a deal that will secure the Sterling legacy for generations to come," she announced. "A $2 billion partnership with Vance Dynamics." The crowd clapped, their faces glowing with admiration for the power and wealth on display. This was the world they understood. This was real strength, not kneeling on the floor to help a clumsy waiter. Arthur Sterling smirked, leaning toward a group of eager businessmen. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial growl, but it was still loud enough to carry. "The CEO of Vance Dynamics is a complete recluse. Never shows their face," he chuckled, puffing out his chest. "Probably some faceless nerd in a basement, but a brilliant one, I'll grant them that." The men around him laughed, a smug, booming chorus. A woman standing near Arthur whispered to her friend, pointing a dismissive finger at Alara. "She doesn't understand a thing about this. Look at her. It's like trying to explain astrophysics to a child." Alara stood perfectly still, letting their words, their arrogance, their utter, catastrophic ignorance wash over her. She lifted her own glass of water, her movements slow and graceful, and a genuine smile, the first of the night, touched her lips. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated irony. "Sounds interesting," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying across the patio in the lull. The crowd laughed again, a final, condescending chuckle. They thought she was clueless, a simple girl impressed by the big numbers. They thought she was acknowledging their world, their power. But her smile didn't waver, it held. She set her glass down, her fingers brushing the stem with a delicate finality, and turned to look up at the stars, away from the glittering, soulless party. For a moment, the vast garden felt small, the air compressing around her as if the universe itself was holding its breath. No one else noticed the shift. No one saw the judge pass her sentence. But Alara felt it. The decision was made. The test was over. The Sterling family had been weighed, measured, and found utterly wanting. The $2 billion deal was dead. She just hadn't signed the death certificate yet. The weeks that followed the engagement party were a study in strained silence. Preston acted as though nothing had happened, showering Alara with gifts and hollow apologies for being distracted. His parents remained icily distant. Alara, for her part, moved through the preparations with a serene, detached grace that the Sterlings mistook for submission. They believed they had won, that the girl from nowhere had been put in her place and would now cling to their son with grateful desperation. They had no inkling that they were not disciplining a future daughter-in-law, but were instead being audited by their last hope for survival. The wedding day arrived, dawning bright and mercilessly clear. The venue was less a church and more a modern cathedral of glass and gold, a monument to the Sterling family's immense wealth. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, refracting off colossal crystal chandeliers and making the entire space glitter with an almost divine light. Every detail, from the thousands of imported white orchids to the velvet cushions on the pews, screamed a fortune. The guests, all 300 of them, were the same cast from the party. Their designer outfits gleamed, their faces a gallery of smug expectation. They had come not to witness a sacred union, but to watch the final act of a spectacle, the official absorption of the plain, unremarkable girl into their gilded world. Alara stood at the altar, a vision of quiet defiance. Her dress was not the voluminous, jewel-encrusted monstrosity Genevieve had pushed for. It was a simple, elegant column of ivory silk that clung to her frame without shouting for attention. Her face was bare of makeup, and her dark hair was woven into a single, loose braid that cascaded down her back. She held a small, simple bouquet of white roses. Beside her, Preston looked like a prince from a fairy tale, his suit tailored to perfection, but his smile was tight, his eyes darting nervously towards his parents in the front row. He was not a groom, he was an actor playing a role, desperate for the approval of his directors. The officiant began, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The traditional words about love, honor, and partnership rang hollow, a stark contrast to the palpable tension that filled the air. Alara's gaze was fixed forward, but her mind was a whirlwind of cold, hard facts. The insults at the party, the disdain in Genevieve's eyes, the weakness in Arthur's character, and most damning of all, Preston's consistent, soul-crushing silence. The ceremony reached the point of the vows. The officiant smiled benevolently. "Do you, Preston?" He never got to finish the sentence. Genevieve Sterling stood up. The rustle of her couture gown was the only sound in the suddenly silent hall. Her posture was ramrod straight, her face a mask of regal authority. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper, but a proclamation, sharp and cold enough to slice through the sacred quiet. "Before my son agrees to this union," she declared, her eyes locked on Alara, "I demand that you state, for all to hear, how much wealth your family possesses. The Sterlings do not welcome liabilities." A shocked silence held for a beat, then erupted. It was not a gasp of horror at the breach of decorum, but a wave of derision. Laughter, cruel and unrestrained, echoed off the glass walls. A man in the front row called out, his face red with amusement, "An ordinary girl cannot simply enter the Sterling family." The room buzzed with agreement, the whispers turning into a hum of righteous judgment. Alara's hands, which had been holding her bouquet loosely, tightened. Her knuckles turned pale, and she could feel the faintest tremor in the delicate white rose petals. This was it. The final, public humiliation she had known was coming. She felt a slight pressure on her arm and turned. It was Preston. His face was pale, his eyes pleading. He leaned in, his voice a low, conspiratorial hiss meant only for her. Perhaps my parents are right, Alara," he whispered, his words a dagger to her heart. "Just tell them something. Make something up, anything. Please, don't make this difficult." And there it was. Not a defense, not a protest, but a request for her to debase herself, to lie, to surrender her last shred of dignity just to smooth his path. The last flicker of warmth she held for him, the faint, dying ember of hope, was extinguished. The hurt, the disappointment, it all vanished, replaced by a chilling, crystalline resolve. She looked from Preston's cowardly face to Genevieve's triumphant sneer to Arthur's cold, appraising stare. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She stepped forward, her bouquet still in one hand. She reached out and took the microphone from the officiant's stunned grasp. She did not snatch it. She took it, her movement as deliberate and assured as signing a contract. She turned to face the crowd, the microphone held loosely in her fingers. "Thank you," she began, her voice perfectly even, amplified to fill every corner of the hall. It was steady as a blade. "Thank you for showing me your true faces." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The laughter quieted, replaced by confused murmurs. "This wedding is over." A sharp, collective gasp sucked the air from the room. The guests stared, their minds scrambling to process what was happening. They assumed she was running, humiliated, broken. Whispers broke out. "Poor thing," she finally snapped. "I knew she couldn't handle the pressure." As Isabella stood at the altar, a corporate lawyer, always chasing clout with the Sterlings, called out from the third row. "Poor thing, you tried so hard to belong," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "But you can't buy class." The guests around him laughed, their voices sharp and gleeful. Ilara set her bouquet down on the altar, her movement slow and deliberate, and turned to face him. "Class isn't bought," she said, her voice clear and even. "It's shown." The lawyer's smile vanished, his expensive silk tie suddenly looking too tight. The laughter around him fizzled out. Preston's face twisted into a mask of fury. "You dare humiliate me before everyone?" he shouted, his voice cracking with wounded pride. The guests leaned forward, their eyes wide, waiting for her to crumble. Ilara looked at him, not with anger or sadness, but with something far colder. "I'm not the one being humiliated, Preston," she said, her voice low and clear. "I am the one who cancels." Then, she did something no one expected. She slipped her free hand into the small, hidden pocket of her wedding dress and produced her phone. Her fingers moved over the screen with a purpose and precision that seemed utterly out of place in the sacred setting. Behind the altar, a massive screen that had been intended to display a romantic montage of the happy couple flickered to life. The smiling photos vanished. In their place, a line of stark, black text appeared against a white background, projected for all 300 guests to see. Vance Dynamics officially terminates the $2B partnership agreement with Sterling Corp. Due to a fundamental lack of respect for its primary partner. The room froze. The silence was absolute, a physical weight that pressed down on everyone. You could have heard a single orchid petal fall to the marble floor. Ilara lowered her phone, her expression calm but unyielding. She looked up at the sea of stunned faces, her gaze sweeping over them before finally landing on the Sterling family. "Apologies for the interruption," she said, the polite words dripping with ice. "I just canceled the $2 billion contract." She paused, letting the shock ripple through the room. You see, the faceless nerd from the basement decided to attend her own wedding. She took a step forward, her presence suddenly filling the entire cathedral. "I am Ilara Vance." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Whispers erupted, frantic and disbelieving. Phones were instantly, secretly pulled out. A quick search was all it took. Ilara Vance, the Phantom CEO, the architect of Vance Dynamics. The most powerful, private woman in the corporate world. The sound of shattering glass cut through the chaos. Genevieve's wine glass had slipped from her trembling fingers, its contents staining the white runner like blood. Her mask of Botox perfection finally cracked, her face going the color of ash as she stared at the screen, then at Ilara, comprehension dawning in her eyes like a slow, horrifying sunrise. Arthur Sterling stood rigid, his mouth open in a silent scream, his face a mask of pure horror. The assets he had demanded Ilara prove were now revealed, and they were large enough to swallow his entire legacy whole and not even notice. And Preston. He made a small, choking sound and collapsed into a nearby velvet chair as if his bones had turned to dust, his face gray with the sudden, brutal understanding of what he had just lost. Alara looked at the three of them, the architects of her humiliation, now the authors of their own ruin. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the silent hall. "And you," she said, her gaze sweeping over their shattered figures, just mocked, humiliated, and tried to audit your own partner. The silence that followed Alara's revelation was a living entity, thick with shock and the dawning horror of consequence. The name Alara Vance reverberated in the minds of every guest. They were not watching a gold digger being cast out. They were witnessing an empire commit suicide on its own altar. The whispers grew frantic, the rustle of expensive fabrics now sounding like the skittering of rats on a sinking ship. Then, the dam of denial broke. It was a misunderstanding. Genevieve's voice was a desperate, cracking plea. She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched, her carefully constructed mask of aristocratic disdain crumbling to reveal raw, pathetic panic. The formidable matriarch was gone, replaced by a groveling beggar. A terrible, terrible misunderstanding, my dear Alara. We were testing you. A little family joke. Arthur, his face drained of all color, nodded vigorously, his cold demeanor replaced by a desperate servility. "We can renegotiate," he said, his voice hoarse, his eyes darting frantically between Alara and the damning message still burning on the screen behind her. "Whatever you want, a bigger share, a seat on the board for you, for your family, anything." Preston staggered to his feet. He grabbed Alara's hand, his grip clammy and weak. The man who wouldn't defend her from a whisper now clung to her as his only lifeline. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low and pleading, his eyes swimming with tears of self-pity, not remorse. "I love you, Alara. I've always loved you. I was just scared of them." He gestured feebly towards his parents. "We can still fix this. We can still be married." The reversal was so immediate, so shamelessly transparent, that it was grotesque. Guests who had been sneering moments before now rushed to add their voices to the chorus of sycophants. "We've always admired your strength, Miss Vance," a woman in a green dress said, her smile painfully tight. "A truly brilliant strategy," another man muttered, trying to catch her eye. "Keeping your identity hidden. Genius." Alara looked at them, at Preston's desperate grip, at Genevieve's trembling hands, at the fake, terrified smiles of the crowd. She saw them not as people, but as empty vessels, their values shifting with the winds of power and profit. A profound sense of cold detachment washed over her. She slowly, deliberately, pulled her hand from Preston's grasp. Before she could speak, a new voice cut through the noise. A man stood up from the guest seats. He was not dressed as ostentatiously as the others. His suit was understated but impeccably tailored, his presence calm but commanding. It was Caleb Thorne, the CEO of Sterling Corp's largest rival. He had been invited out of professional obligation, an enemy kept close. He had watched the entire spectacle unfold, his expression one of quiet contemplation. He walked down the aisle, his steps steady and sure, parting the frantic crowd. He didn't look at the Sterlings. His eyes were only on Alara. He stopped before her and gently took her hand, the one Preston had just been clutching. His grip was not desperate. It was firm, warm, and deeply respectful. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying to the back of the hall. "I have admired your work with Vance Dynamics for years. What I have seen today has allowed me to admire the woman behind it even more." He paused, his kind eyes holding hers. "We are not just potential partners. If you'll have me, I want to build a real family with you, one based on respect from the very first day." The room exploded in a fresh wave of gasps. This was no longer just a business deal collapsing. It was a public transfer of allegiance, a corporate and personal coup happening in real time. Alara looked at Caleb Thorne. She saw in his eyes none of the weakness she'd seen in Preston's, none of the cruelty she'd seen in the Sterlings. She saw strength, integrity, and a quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself. For the first time all day, the tension in her shoulders eased. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the answer he needed. Together, her hand still in his, they turned their backs on the altar, on the wreckage of the Sterling family. As they began to walk down the aisle, the hall shifted. Phones, which had been buzzing with secret searches, now blared with official news alerts. Sterling Corp stock in freefall after Vance Dynamics partnership terminated. Langford Empire crumbles as bride cancels wedding and $2B deal. The screen behind the altar flashed again, now displaying a live feed from a major news outlet. The headline was brutal and direct. The guests, seeing the digital writing on the wall, began to slip out, their faces pale. They scurried away, desperate to distance themselves from a family now publicly labeled a disgrace. Just as Alara and Caleb reached the grand doors, they burst open. A flood of reporters, alerted by anonymous tips, pushed through, their cameras flashing like lightning, their voices shouting questions. "Miss Vance, is it true you canceled the Sterling deal at the altar? The bride who destroyed an empire." Alara didn't look back. She didn't need to. She walked through the storm of flashing lights, her steps steady, Caleb's hand a warm anchor in hers. But the Sterlings were not finished. Their panic had curdled into venomous rage. "No one will ever love you," Preston screamed, his voice echoing in the half-empty hall, a pathetic, wounded cry. "It's always about money with you. You'll die alone with your empire." A few bitter guests, old business enemies of Alara's, joined in the chorus of hate. "The cold CEO will never know happiness," a man muttered, his face contorted with envy. The air grew heavy with their venom. Alara stopped walking for just a moment, her hand tightening on Caleb's. A small, worn photograph slipped from the hidden pocket of her dress, fluttering to the marble floor. It was a picture of a little girl with dark hair, standing next to a woman with the same kind eyes, both of them smiling in a simple garden. Her mother, the woman who had taught her that integrity was the only asset that could never be devalued. She bent down, picked it up, and tucked it safely away. She didn't look at Preston. She didn't need to. As she and Caleb stepped out into the bright sunlight, leaving the cathedral of gold and glass behind them, they were met not with scorn, but with the thunderous applause of the reporters and the few remaining guests who recognized true power when they saw it. The aftermath was quiet but brutal. Genevieve's desperate, tear-streaked face was replayed on every news channel. She was quietly let go from every charity board, her name now toxic. Arthur's company lost half its investors in a week, the headlines forever branding him the mogul who mocked his own lifeline. Preston's sponsorships and trust fund evaporated. His face became a meme, a symbol of arrogance and folly, captioned, "Billionaire's son left at the altar by his own bailout package." Alara never commented on any of it. Her silence was more powerful than any statement. She moved forward, her steps steady, her life her own. The world now saw her not as a shadow or a nobody, but as the woman who held the board, made the rules, and demanded respect. She didn't gloat. She didn't turn back to survey the wreckage. The people who had judged her, who had laughed and sneered, had lost more than a deal. They had lost their legacy, their dignity, and their chance to know the remarkable woman they had so carelessly cast aside. And that, Alara Vance knew, was a price far greater than $2 billion.